Scruffy Politics, we are back. Brian Krause is back here. He wrote the book The Law and Men, the third chapter titled Men and Sexual Misconduct. It's a very good read in chapter 3. I liked it, went into great detail. Brian, can you elaborate more about what chapter 3 is about?
Sure. Well, obviously, we're just slightly on the other side of the Me Too movement. And one of the concerning things during the Me Too movement was that there was, in my opinion, a very strong push to undermine very important, centuries old principles of due process in our justice system. And the whole basis for this was this faulty idea that in the past men were somehow allowed to get away with sexual abuse of women. And one of the phrases I would hear a lot during the Me Too movement when people were being held accountable was, well, men are finally being held accountable, finally, as though there's this long history where men were not held accountable. But as you know, in chapter 3, I go into detail about how, and we talked about this in the first episode a little bit. Of course, these statutes the definitions were such that only men could be guilty of these crimes, only women could be victims. I point out until 1977, in some states, rape could be punished by death. And where it wasn't punished by death, for instance, in the United Kingdom, I could talk about the common law in other common law countries as well. You could have be sentenced to life in prison for such crimes. Now, I do want to point out again when I remember all these debates I've had with people. When I've pointed this out, I remember one response I got from someone was, well, yeah, how many rich white men got put to death for this crime? And of course, the answer is probably not a whole lot, because typically when you have money to pay for good lawyers, you're not going to get the maximum penalty. But the fact that our law prescribed such penalties, and the fact that it still prescribes certain harsh penalties, and I can go into that if you want, it's an indication our system has never taken sexual abuse lightly, never. Of course, anybody, if they want to try to make a point, can find some example where somebody got away with abuse, or where certainly you can find ignorant people who say misogynistic things like, she was dressed provocatively, she deserved it, or some ignorant thing like that. That has not been the main theme of our law and culture. It's been just the opposite. We've punished men harshly for sexual abuse, and appropriately so, because it's a terrible crime.
Yeah, true. And even in cases where it's been found out the accuser has falsely accused, I think of, and you've mentioned it, I'm not sure if it's this chapter or another chapter, Trevor Bauer, a former Major League pitcher. He now plays in Mexico, I think. Very good pitcher, very talented. He was, he does questionable things outside of baseball, and not someone who I would hang out with, but he was falsely accused of sexual misconduct and the R word against a woman it was proven that she wanted to set this whole thing up just to get all his money. And now, even though after the fact that he was a victim of what she did, like Major League Baseball is saying, no, you can't come back, even on the minimum salary, And he's offered, hey, I'll come back and play for the minimum salary. And he's blackballed from baseball. So it's cases like that where I think it hurts men as well. Right?
Hurts men, and I would argue it hurts women too.
Yeah.
Because again, there are some women who struggle with, who have been abused, who have to struggle to overcome this skepticism. But this skepticism, as I point out, comes from a reasonable place, because you have situations like with the Trevor Bauer case, and I do mention that in chapter 4. I go into that a little bit. Frightening, frightening. I mean, a mere accusation cost him. I mean, I read one estimate that he lost $37.5 million in compensation, which when you think about it, that's insane that someone can do that. Just make an accusation, no proof, and here we are. He's still struggling. And you could say, well, boo-hoo, he's a rich ball player. Imagine what this does to men much further down on the totem pole. It's devastating.
Yeah, I mean, it could ruin their lives. Fortunately for Bauer, he has money, and he figured out a way to continue making money or continue playing ball. But yeah, his life won't be how it was when his first few years into baseball, first 5 or 6 years. And I I just saw that. That's right. That's your next chapter. That's right. But yeah, and
Well, let me ask you this. Let me ask you this, and forgive me for I know it's your show. I don't want to
no,
ask the
no, but
questions or
yeah,
hog the mic here, but just think about this. When you bring up Trevor Bauer, imagine that his accuser was a lot more intelligent and a lot more sneaky, right? I mean, you found these text messages that showed she was lying. Imagine an accuser who's much more sympathetic, much smarter, much craftier. It's a frightening thought to me.
yeah, and yeah, and very frightening. And like you said, especially someone who's not rich and way down on the totem pole, that could ruin their whole life. That could
Yep.
be the end of their life. They're, no more job opportunities, so that's pretty scary right there. And like I think I mentioned this in the first episode, um, brings me back to that Downers Grove South, the former teacher at Downers Grove South, Christina Formella, where she basically participated in sexual acts with a student, um, and there's many counts against her. And I'm sure people are outraged, but not as outraged as if it would be a male teacher on um, a female student. And that's just as horrible. I mean, any teacher who does that on a student, I mean, they, I mean, they need to be punished to the fullest extent. However, um, the comments I see, like let's say on Facebook, about this teacher, guys saying, "Oh, where was she when I was in high school?" or those those kind of comments, Um,
Right, right.
whereas it kind of gives her a pass, and maybe does it kind of give women more of a pass sometimes because they're less physically threatening. You know that they're not gonna, most of them aren't gonna beat you to a pulp and continue forcing themselves on you. So, whereas in her case, it's probably statutory rape. Am I right?
Yeah, no, that would be correct. Yeah. Some form of that. That would be correct. Yeah.
Okay,
And
good.
and and no, I mean, one of the cases that I cited in chapter 3, if you remember, I don't know, but there was one case where you had a male minor who had been abused by an older female, and in some states, those men, once they reach the age of majority, they're compelled to pay child support to the women who abused them, right?
Mm,
And the reasoning, of course, is, well, it doesn't matter how the kid got here, but the kid is here, and the state has an interest in the child receiving financial compensation. And in one of those cases, a judge made a remark to the effect of, well, he was a victim, but he actively participated in the sexual activities. And I made the point, when people say the same kind of thing about minor women, like, well, she was in participating in this, she, even though she technically can't consent, she wasn't forced or whatever. I mean, people lose their minds. Oh, that's sexism, that's misogyny. The same kind of thing that's done to men rarely produces the same kind of outrage. I do think it's changing a little bit, as I mentioned in your first episode. But yeah, there's still much more deference given to, I think, female perpetrators. And I just disagree with this idea that there's this long history, this past where our society just overlooked abuse or didn't think it was a big deal. I don't think, I mean, you can certainly find cases where that happened and that's horrible, and I don't make light of that, but I don't think that has been the overall, let's put it this way, I don't think that has been a common trend in our law and in our culture. I think it's just the opposite.
Okay, yeah. And would you agree with me? Because maybe I'm kind of biased. I look at this Christina Formella case out of Downers Grove South, and I think, okay, she like if you look at her picture, she's really pretty. She seems like a nice person, well-rounded, and then this happens, and then you think, well, does she really deserve a long time in prison because of what she did? I mean, look at her. She doesn't look like she could hurt a soul, you know? And a part of me is like, what would a lot of years in prison really do for her except just be behind, bars? And I'm sure she'll never do this again. However, then another part of me is like, wait, but if there's a man, me, I'd be saying, oh, get him in prison for the rest of his life. But there is also the biased part of me which says, yeah, I don't think she'll ever do this again. She can't physically overpower most men. So, and is that maybe how the courts view it as well? Where, well, what would this really do?
Actually, I think you touch on a very, I think that's a really good question. Here's what I think happens. What I think happens is that while the criminal mindset for a man and the woman is the same in the sense that they've crossed a boundary that they know they shouldn't cross, I do think people tend to think, and somewhat reasonably so, and I know I'm going to get in trouble for saying this, but the fear is that the women victims suffer more psychological damage than male victims. And again, I know this is controversial, but I do think there's probably some truth to that. And so I think courts have probably taken the position that this boundary that's been crossed by this adult has resulted in more damage to the females than it has to the male victims. Again, and there might be some reasonable basis for thinking that. Now, from the perspective of the criminal mindset, though, obviously any adult who crosses this boundary, it's just as bad when the man does it versus when a woman does it. But I think you're right. I think courts probably don't see the women as dangerous, and I don't think they see the psychological damage manifesting itself in men as much. I mean, that's just a fact. It's again, it's controversial, but I think it's true, and I think that's what's played a role sometimes in some of these lighter sentences for the women. But even so, even if there's a defensible logic to the disparate treatment between men and women, it still goes to this issue of, is there this long history, or even in current situations where men just get away with this and society overlooks it? The answer is no. We've always held men accountable. We hold men accountable now. Men do not get away with sexual abuse, generally speaking.
Okay, nice. This has been a good talk, and I think we delved into chapter 4 a little bit. I think I skipped ahead also there. Is there anything else you want to say about chapters 3 and some of 4 before we head off?
I would say with chapter 3, even presently, even though the laws have changed a little bit, men receive longer prison sentences than women do, more harsh punishments. Men in some states can be castrated which that's arguably a violation of the Eighth Amendment. But we take sexual abuse so seriously that we impose these penalties. So this idea that men get away with abuse, it's just not well founded, and it's just, generally speaking, that is not how our law and culture have dealt with abuse.
And how can it be fixed, in your view?
Well, I first of all, I think the most important thing is we need to value due process. Due process is not an impediment to justice. I know it's unpleasant when someone who has been abused has to try to prove this in court, has to recount all these horrific details of the abuse. I get it. Due process is not the enemy of justice. Blackstone said, Justice Blackstone said it's better for, Judge Blackstone, that is, it's better for 10 guilty persons to go free than to punish one innocent. Due process is important. We shouldn't see it as an impediment to justice. The other thing, I think we just need to recognize that we punish men severely for abuse, and this whole idea that they get away with it is mythical. It's not true. It's not rooted in correct information, and I think we need to reject that and continue to hold men accountable, but to do so while also valuing due process.
Hey, that's a good point. And yeah, that's chapter 3 is a good read. So if you have not read it, read this book. This book is great. It's the best book I've read in a while. It explains everything. It's not. You would think, okay, you're reading a book about law that a lawyer writes. It's going to be confusing. There's not a whole lot of legal jargon you have to move around in and figure out. It's clearly written. So thank you for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, anytime.